One thing I forgot to say in the last video before we go on to the JSON example is, look how nice these try-catch statements are. So not only can I log the information in the logger, but it's a good idea to display the information to the user. So for example, let's say the user is logging in and the login credentials are wrong. If you log that to the log file, that's great. But then the user keeps clicking login and they don't know why it's not working. So you got to have that user feedback. You got to display some messages to the user so they know what's going on. And this is a good example of how to do it. So when you're doing try catches, if any exception happens, let the user know what happened by displaying some alert or displaying an error message. Okay, that's actually part of your final project. So you'll see exception and error handling. This is very important. Also UI development, UI design. So when an error occurs, it's good that you handle it. It's good that you check the age and make sure it was an integer. But if it's not an integer, you need to let the user know. Otherwise, they won't understand why they weren't able to enter in that information. So that corresponds with error handling and UI development. When you show that error, it needs to be in a user-friendly way so the user knows what's going on. Okay, we're moving on in the serialization lecture to the JSON example. This is a great example. A lot of people are using JSON nowadays. It's a very common data interchange format. So whenever I'm formatting the data and I want to send it over to another server or send it to a user, and whenever they receive it, it doesn't matter whether they're using Java, Python, JavaScript, any language. Most languages, I would say all languages can read JSON, because JSON, what is it? You need to know this for the exam. JSON is called JavaScript Object Notation. Okay, W3 Schools has a good definition here. I'll use W3 Schools if I test you on the final exam. So JSON is JavaScript Object Notation. It's a syntax. It's a syntax. It's a format for storing and exchanging data. JSON is text. It's a string. Okay, it's a particular way that the text or the string is formatted, and it's written in JavaScript Object Notation. Okay, I actually recommend you read this page here. This is a good page to go over if I were to test you on the exam. You'll see when exchanging data between a browser and a server, so a browser would be the user or the local machine. So whenever I'm sending from client to server, the data can only be text, okay, or a string. You may see me use the keyword string here. String and text are the same. So JSON is a text or it's a string, and we can convert any JavaScript object or Java object. JavaScript and Java are completely different, but I can convert basically any object into JSON and send JSON to the server. We can also convert any JSON received from the server back into objects. Well, what did we just do in the serialization lecture? We took an object, we converted it and saved it to a file. Then I closed the app, I opened the app back up, and I took that conversion and loaded it back into an object. That's the same thing here. I can convert any object into JSON, and I can take that JSON and put it back into an object. So that's still serialization. It's just a different method. This way we can work with the data as regular objects with no complicated parsing and translations. When I looked at the previous example, it works, it's easy, but I got to be using a JVM. I got to be using Java or the Java compiler to really read that serialization file. Python's not going to be able to read it unless they built some library that converts it. But Python has their own conversion. You know, JavaScript has its own conversion. It's not going to be uniform across languages, but JSON is, because JSON is just text. It's just a string. So it's not so complicated. If we open that file back up, you'll see it's pretty complicated. It wasn't even human readable. So here's an object. Okay, you'll see I have an object. I have key value pairs. You can think of a hash map. This is like a hash map in Java. I have my hash map, which is key value pairs. So you'll see name is a string that's equal to John. Age is an int, which is equal to 31. City is a string, which is equal to New York. When I call stringify, It's going to take the object and turn it into JSON. Well, what's that going to look like? It's going to look like this. This is the format of JSON. So you'll see it starts with a bracket, then it has a key. Keys are always in quotes, followed by a colon, followed by the value. The value is only in quotes if it's a string. You'll see age here is not in quotes because that's an int. You'll see the key value pairs are separated by a comma. So then I have my next key value pair. So the next key is age. It's a key because it's in quotes. Then I have a colon, and then I have 31, which is an int. Technically, right now, it's in a string. So this whole thing is a string, but after I parse it in back to an object, we know this is an int. Then I have a comma, and I have my next key value pair, which is city. City is the key, and then the value is separated by a colon. The value is a string, which is New York. Then the last one does not have a comma, but it does have the closing bracket. Okay, it also has the closing bracket. So when I call JSON parse, I'm going to take this string and turn it back into an object. And look at this. I can do the dot notation. So I can say object.name, and it'll go and grab John. While it's a string, I can't do that. While it's a string, it's just it's a formatted string. So I can send this JSON over to the client or over to the server or over to the whatever, across the web or through the file system. It doesn't really matter where the string is being stored or sent to, but eventually it's going to be parsed back into an object, and then I could use it just like I can like a regular Java object. So I could use the dot notation to call a field, or I can use the dot notation to call a method. Okay, and that's the basic information about JSON. You can send it, you can store it. In fact, if you've heard of MongoDB, MongoDB uses JSON as its primary format. It's actually called BSON because it's binary JSON, but it's similar. They even created a database that stores JSON, and that's MongoDB. Now, here's some good test questions that I may ask you. What does JSON stand for? It's JavaScript Object Notation. What is JSON? It's a lightweight data interchange format. JSON is self-describing and easy to understand. It's human readable. And here's the most important part. It's language independent. It doesn't rely on Java. It doesn't rely on Python. Okay. All the languages that I know can read JSON. You'll see JSON uses the JavaScript syntax, but JSON format is text only. Text can be read and used as a data format by any programming language. Okay, you'll see here JSON format was originally specified by Douglas Crockford. You'll want to read this. Make sure you go back over it. Actually run the examples. I like W3 Schools because you can actually run the code and see what happens. But you'll want to know JSON for the final exam. So download this zip. Let's take a look at the JSON example. Once you download the zip, load it into NetBeans, and let's see how we can serialize JSON. So I have the same person. Okay, you'll see it's implement serializable, just like we did before. Okay, so I can use the import to make that a little bit cleaner. Now, back when I first made this application, the JDK really didn't have a good way to read JSON or parse JSON. So I use an external library, just like I did with the threaded unzipper. Okay, remember the threaded unzipper application where I used the zip4j library from a third party? For your final project, don't write things from scratch. Search online. Don't reinvent the wheel. Go ahead and use libraries, use APIs, use resources that you find. Just make sure you reference them. Don't claim them as your own. So back then, they didn't really have a JSON parser. So I went online and I searched Java JSON parser. Okay, and you can do some searching. They probably have different ones now. Maybe the JDK even has one. But you know, back from JDK 8 and before, they really didn't have one. So I used one called JSON Simple. JSON Simple is one of the most popular ones at the time creating this project. Okay, it's really easy to download and import. You'll see it's even supported by Google. Google has the jar file that you can download, and it's simple. You can create a JSON object, and then you can call a file writer. Okay, you'll see, and I can call toJSON string. Then when I have the string, I can read it back in. So I can call the parse method, which takes the string and puts it back into a JavaScript object or a JSON object. So we're going to use the JSON symbol library. So I downloaded the jar file for you already. In fact, if you open up the file that you downloaded for the lecture, I've included it. Whenever you have pictures or jar files for your project, you'll want to include them in your project folder. So you'll see here's the JSON example lecture that we're going over. I included the jar file right here. And that's important because when I export this from NetBeans, the jar file will be included. So when the TAs grade it, they'll have access to the libraries that you use. This is very important. If I put this outside of my project directory, then whenever I export it with NetBeans, the jar file will not be included. The TA will not be able to run your application, and most likely they're going to give you a 0. Okay, they may try to search quickly online to find your library, but if it's a library that's not very common or it's not very easy to set up, then they need to move on. And that's a mistake that you made by not including your jar file. So make sure you put your jar file in the right place by putting it right here in the root directory. So whenever you export your project through NetBeans, the jar file will be included. In addition, when it's in your project directory, you can use a relative path. So when the TA grades it, they don't have to change the path. What I recommend to do is to submit your final project, and then once you submit it, download it to a different location on your machine, or even download it to another machine if you happen to have another machine at home, and try to run your app just like the TA would. If you download it from Canvas and it doesn't work because of paths or you forgot the jar files, then you know it won't work for the TA. Fix that up and resubmit. That way you don't get a 0. If you have images, you can put them in the root directory here. Or if you have videos, you can also put them in the root directory here. But I've seen students actually create their own package. So they have another package with all their images in it. They have another package with all their videos in it. And that way you can use it in the code easily. So if you want to use the library easily, put it in the root directory. If you want to use images easily for your code, make a separate package for them. So you'll come over here on the source package, you'll create a new package, and you can call it images. Put all your images there. You may create another one, call it videos. Put all your videos there, just like we did for the audio viz lecture and the audio viz challenge. Okay, so now I have this library. I want to use it. How do I import the library? So if I open up libraries, you'll see I just have the JDK. I'm going to show you how to import the library in the next video. So stick with Professor Wergeles and we'll see you in the next video.